Hello, I'm Dr. Stephanie Pinder-Amaker. I'm a psychologist who works with students, families, and schools, and I'm a senior advisor to the Steve Fund. Welcome to the Steve Fund Family Webinar, Young Men of Color at College, supporting the mental health of your student. We created this webinar especially for family members, parents, grandparents, siblings, guardians, and any other member of the biological or found families who seek to support their young men of color and their mental health and well-being as they navigate their college experience. After watching this webinar, you will be able to list the specific challenges young men of color encounter in the college environment and how the college experience impacts their social, emotional, academic, and mental health. Assess and connect with both peer and professional resources on campus. You'll be able to develop new approaches for talking with your young man of color about race, identity, intersectionality, and mental health, and adopt and integrate preventative approaches in your household to help your student to thrive. Joining me today is Dr. Michael Mason, who is an Associate Dean at University of Virginia and is the Director of the Luther Porter Jackson Black Cultural Center. In that role, Dr. Mason is responsible for creating opportunities to link Black culture and identity development to the whole Black student experience. He was also the director of Project Rise, a powerful peer counseling project created for Black students by Black students. Welcome, Dr. Mason.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. So, we're taping this webinar on January 20th, Inauguration Day in America. And for those of you who were not alive 2 weeks ago, you saw one of the most tragic moments in our country. And I assure you, it feels very different today doing this webinar for you than it did 2 weeks ago. So it's such a wonderful day to be talking about this important topic, during what feels like a real window of hope that people can be restored and that our health and wellness matters. So thank you for having me today. I think without too much hyperbole, in the spirit of Eric Garner, I think today is the first time I've been able to take a full breath in a long time. And I'm glad to have this conversation.
Thank you, and thank you for the historical marker of Inauguration Day. I'm wearing my pearls and my Chucks, and I agree that a lot of people probably share that feeling that they're finally able to breathe in a little more deeply today. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you, Dr. Mason, today, especially at this time when it is so very needed. And as you know, I am the founding director of the College Mental Health Program and am the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at McLean Hospital. And in these roles over the past 5 or 6 years especially, we have found that the number one question coming in from leaders of colleges and universities is this: can you help us promote and support the mental health of college students of color more effectively? Why do you think this is such a critical question for colleges right now?
I share with you that, we get those questions daily, yearly, in and out of our work here at the University of Virginia. So we join with you in that. First, as a country, we've created tremendous pressure for all of our citizens to complete college. The difference in earning potential of people with college degrees compared to those without them is extraordinary. Even more specifically, for instance, we know if a student has not taken calculus by the time that they graduate high school, they will have a lifetime salary cap of about $80,000. The pressure then for young people of all ethnicities and aspects of diversity to succeed is great. However, as we have created this pressure, we haven't necessarily considered the disparities and impact on our youth, and particularly youth of color. Students of color, for instance, including young men, carry this burden and the weight of it. And we always have. And I think this moment is particularly important because as we've watched for the last decade, witnessed an increase in added pressures to people of color, we've also grown and walked into what feels more like a hopeful moment. So right now, colleges are reckoning with their delayed response to balancing this weight that I've referenced. But now they're preparing to share in the effort to truly help students of color thrive and not just survive. To do it with them instead of just encouraging them to do it on their own. So for me, I think this is a great moment to join in this conversation because I think everybody's primed to do something different, to do something better.
Yeah, so I'm starting to hear a through line of hope.
That's today. Yes.
So I think we're going to be hearing a lot of that today, and it's so important. I'm also hearing you say that with respect to our students of color, it's important at this time, especially not to be too far ahead. And certainly we don't want to lag behind, but we really want to join them and be as in step and aligned
Yes.
as possible, right? So in preparing for this webinar, I saw a quote from you posted on the University of Virginia website. In it, you say, as a people, we must be diligent in our struggles to understand and appreciate the meanings of Black, historically and currently, to each of us individually, and to the extent possible, to all of us collectively. It is equally important to connect this understanding and appreciation of the ways we prepare our students for leading, learning, and living as young Blacks in our global society. Can you speak to the specific challenges of Black and Brown students in particular and how this connects with their mental health and well-being?
Right. I think the first challenge facing Black and Brown students is really found in the question you asked itself. The words Black and Brown have meaning, and often this meaning carries with it experiences that have more salience outside of the person than actually inside the person. And that's a difficult experience to sort of walk and live through daily, trying to reconcile these two things. And we don't spend enough time investing in learning more about how the individual student is making sense of how they've experienced their ethnicity and their culture. Instead, we make assumptions. But Black has meaning, Brown has meaning, and we have to negotiate the shared external meaning, carry it, at the same time that we find ways to navigate our understanding of it and grow in ways that are not limited by it. So for me, I think that's one of the core challenges that Black and Brown students will face coming into higher education, both in predominantly white institutions and historically Black colleges and universities alike. They have to address the differences between how they're experiencing themselves and how the world is experiencing them, because those challenges will bring with it certain, emotional difficulties. And I think that's a big part of it. The other is, I think we have to embrace this work of creating frameworks for helping students understand fluctuations in wellness, in mental health, so that they can become more savvy in recognizing when they themselves are having concerns or when they are at the or when they're being impacted by what's happening in the world outside of them. I think that's a really big deal as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting to be learning more, as you say, through research about the impact that individual Black and Brown identity has on the mental health and well-being, juxtaposed or in the context of how Black and Brown identities are also perceived by society. Okay, so this is a webinar focused on the needs of young men of color and how their families can best support their wellness. I wonder if you can speak specifically to the unique barriers, determinants, and challenges of young men of color.
So that's a great place to start or continue. I think we are already pretty far along this conversation. I typically start responding to this question, particularly when I'm talking to families with risk factors for dropping out of college. We've learned from years of research that gender is predictive. Men are more likely to drop out than women. Race is predictive. Black and brown students are more likely to drop out than others. Whether you're attending a 4-year or 2-year institution is predictive. 4 years is more predictive. Full-time enrollment or part-time enrollment, full-time is more predictive. Working full-time or part-time versus not working at all, and in this case, working full-time is more predictive. Being involved in Greek life or not is predictive. Being involved in Greek life is a risk factor.
Mm.
So when I engage with families, I often start with this reality, and I say to them, I am working with a Black man at a 4-year institution, many who will have work study or full-time employment. Uh, and many, studies will also show that two of the things that are most helpful to students as they enter in to mitigate, some of the impact that, these risk factors represent is whether or not students are able to articulate their experiences, affectively, um, and the education levels of the parents. One of those we can control when we get to students. The other we cannot. In this case, it's we can't do anything about the education levels of parents, but we definitely can work with whether students are able to articulate their experiences or not.
Mhm.
So what I am often facing is receiving a young man who often is, carrying, at least 5 out of the 6 risk factors for dropping out of school. And the one that we have the most impact on is beginning to help that person develop some affective capacity to describe their experience and also begin to develop an interest in the experiences of others. And I think that's really important. So we try to give young men the skills they need to articulate their experiences. And one of the things that is also interesting here is because we are preoccupied with risk factors, we sort of create some unintended challenges, I think, for students of color.
Mhm.
Uh, we try to teach them that if they just buckle down and work hard in a John Henry-esque sort of way, they might make sure that they don't have any setbacks. And often, instead, they find themselves often alone, struggling to establish meaningful relationships that they can sense or feel is contributing to that, John Henry sort of movement. Uh, but what we know as mental health practitioners is that relationships require vulnerability, and for many Black and brown men, vulnerability is experienced as a weakness. So this weakness then disrupts or interrupts any real conversation about masculinity or manliness. And there is quite a bit of stigma, so much stigma around vulnerability and weakness, that it also becomes a barrier to really exploring the intersections between race and sexuality. And that barrier has been in place for centuries, right? So I
Mhm.
believe a key challenge for young men and of color is really building, expanding, and accepting a full range of support that will allow them to grow in their ability to hold the full range of experiences of being a man of color for themselves, but also for others. And I think that's a big deal, and that's heavy work that I don't know that we've always been equipped to do for and with young men of color in higher education.
I like that you're naming the risks and speaking directly to parents to help everyone understand what they are. Um, but also you're teaching parents what they can do to do something that we as mental health practitioners really urge our students to do, especially in these really uncertain times, which is in essence control the controllable. Yes, there
Yes.
are risks, but that you do have power, you do have leverage. There are things that you can control. And it's so helpful to hear specifically from you some of these ways in which parents can influence the mental health and academic outcomes of their young men of color.
Yes.
It's really
And
a powerful message.
in this case, it can be as simple as, and I know it sounds so cliched, um, but listening and being heard is
Mm,
so powerful.
mm,
And that's probably, I'm obviously biased as a Black man, but I feel like it's particularly powerful for Black men to be heard and to develop the capacity to listen. I think that's a gold mine. If families can tap into that and make themselves available to one another to do that, I think we move quite ahead in the game, of making sure that we're matriculating young people as best as they can be.
That's really important. And I don't think it's a cliche at all when you put it
Mm-hmm.
in this very important context.
Mm-hmm.
So I know a lot of your work has focused on the role of friends and peers in
Mm-hmm.
responding to mental health needs as they emerge. And that work was largely rooted in your work at Project Rise, which is an amazing
Mm-hmm.
program. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the role of peers as a resource and the work done specifically at Project Rise.
Right. So I am very fortunate in that I was, I benefited from, inheriting Project Rise. I've been working with Project Rise since 2010. It's amazing. It's over 10 years now. But it was started by a small group of students who were sort of stressed uh, by what they experienced as the university's difficulty to sort of think with them about their unique cultural needs and the intersection of their cultural needs and their emotional and mental health needs. And they didn't feel like our university was doing a great job at the time. So they went in and built out a model or requested a support to build a training model that could help Black students in particular begin to recognize emotional distress and respond to it in meaningful ways. Uh, Rise, in its original, conception, meant resolving issues through support and education. Literally, that's what it
Mm-hmm.
was.
Mm-hmm.
Over the last 10 years, I've sort of learned a lot through, the research that I'm doing here at our university. And one of the things that I learned quite early in this process is uh, it sort of works against sort of the classic narrative around help seeking behaviors in people of color. And I think, I might have said this in other places, but there is this thought that, people of color have poor help seeking behaviors. We don't seek out or we don't ask for help or we try to do things alone. But one of the first things that I discovered is that actually people are seeking help. They're just not seeking help at the points where data is collected. And for us, we started to understand immediately that 73% of the support that students are getting, the initial response is
Yeah.
actually coming from the peer level, not the professional level. So by the time that we've gotten them, students have been dealing with the issue for several days to weeks to months. But students have been trying to be helpful. So one of the things that I've now, committed my whole life to, and I think, again, from the inauguration today. Watch the video if you haven't. But there was this reference to Lincoln's statement about my whole soul is in it.
Mm.
Uh, and my whole soul now is committed to this peer support process because I'm convinced that in university life, the vast majority of interventions are going to be coming from students. And Project Rise then has now become dedicated to making sure that we're equipping that population of providers with the skills they need to not only see, but respond. And when they feel like they're in over their head, they refer. So recognize, respond, refer are three of the biggest things that we need to do, at this college level. And I think that's really important. So, we have young Black students who have now taken, two courses that I teach that equips them to become, little mini. I used to joke and say mini me's, but that can be a lot of pressure on me or them. But really to just become emerging peer counselors. And one of the things that is really beautiful to me is I've had students who, have emailed or texted me and said, Dean Mason, you'll be so proud of me. I put my peer counselor hat on last night at the party. I noticed somebody wasn't themselves and
Yeah.
I intervened. And one of the things that's most important about those sort of anecdotes is I learned that the face to face is but one style of intervention. If I can begin to get students to organically, where they are, recognize emotional, social, academic, and relational distress and respond to it, I can begin to improve the experience of students across the university. The other thing, really quickly, is Project Rise was created for Black students by Black students. And one of the things that I discovered quickly is that if I'm only teaching Black students to recognize and respond, then I have no impact on what's happening to Black students. So instead of just teaching Black students these important skills, I opened it up to the whole university. So each semester now we're having anywhere between 50 and 70 students take a course that I teach, peer counseling theory and skills. And that
Hmm.
has been tremendous
Yeah.
for our students who then, after taking the course, commit to become peer counselors and work with students.
That's really beautiful. And it sort of demonstrates the fact that the responsibility for change, we talk a lot about inoculating students against the stressors or racism or discrimination, but the responsibility rests not only with students of color, right, but with the entire institution, with all members of the community. And it sounds like Project Rise is an excellent model of what you were just referring to earlier in how important it is for students, all students, but for students of color to be heard, seen, to be listened to. I believe that all of the best campus-based interventions obviously are initiated and held by students. And we
Mm.
continue to learn so much from them. So, okay, not every student has a Project Rise on
Yes.
campus. So, how can students and their families connect with the resources they need without something like an exemplary program, Project
Hmm.
Rise, at their college specifically? What would you recommend?
Hmm. So I think for me, for any family who's getting ready to, um, loan,
Mm.
their investment to someone else, I would encourage you to be a really good stakeholder in that process and begin to identify somebody who you can make that transaction with. Every year, in July and then again in August, I am sort of flooded with parents who have found me on the internet and come to me specifically to say, Dean Mason, I am entrusting my child to you, and I want him back better than when I gave him to you. Now, that's a lot of weight, right? Because, things can go awry. Um, but it happens. And
Yes.
invariably, those students who I make that agreement with parents definitely get what they need, right? Because the reality is, as a student affairs professional, we're going to get thousands of students yearly. And I can't see them all, even though I do a really good job and I try to do that. But I think as a parent, really invest heavily in doing the research to say who are the champions at that university for Black or Brown students and make a commitment to finding them and make a transaction, which
Yes.
is I'm giving my child over to you for this period of time, and you better give him back to me better. That to me is a big deal. That's a starting point. The other thing that I think is important learning from Project Rise, even if there isn't a formal program, Project Rise is about leveraging relationships,
Mm.
and every student has the luxury of the opportunities to build relationships. So for me, what I would encourage students to do is really do some deep assessment and reflection, self-reflection about the nature of the relationships you've built or are building, and starting to determine whether or not those relationships are complex and rich, or whether they're just simple and transactional. So a lot of the students who I work with, until I sort of bring this into to their attention, will sort of surround themselves with relationships that are either one off, which is, I go to you for this one thing and I don't necessarily ever have to see you again, or they become transactional, which
Mm.
is I need someone to say hello to me, so I'm going to say hello to you. And they say that, and then they don't really have any other exchange until the next time they need that. Or they go to the party and they dance together and they don't do it again until they need that, right?
Hmm.
But most of these relationships are, surface level. For me, what I would encourage people to do is starting to think about how many of the relationships that are surrounding you are actually meant to be transformational. And
Mhm.
transformational relationships are the ones where people can commit to observe things. So how many people around you notice when you're feeling sad? How many people around you notice when you're angry? How many people notice when you're anxious? How many people know when you're frustrated and actually will comment on it? If you don't have anybody in your circle like that, then you need to start evaluating your relationships. And that's not necessarily formal, that's not any formal intervention. I think that's just having the skill set to know and the desire to know that your relationships can be meaningful. And you
Yes.
can then go about feeling, doing the work to sort of build out those relationships. So for me, I think any student who does not have this formal program can still have the expectation that the people they are surrounding themselves can express an interest in them. And in return, they can express that interest in others. And then you begin to create opportunities for people to have, uh, conversations about not feeling great, conversations about feeling great. Like today, I'm glad y'all came so I could talk to somebody and say this was a wonderful day. We need people to have conversations with. So I think those are two big ones. And then
Yes.
the other is look for resources. The university is spending a lot of money to hire people like you and I to be available to all students, and some of us have particular interest in young men, black and brown men, and I think that's wonderful if they can find us because it allows for us, and I say this quite a bit at our university. I'm one of the few people in the world, definitely in this country, who can say every day I wake up and get paid to do my mission work, which is to support students of color. I was made to do it. I think I'm right in my, I'm in the zone, as my daughter
Mm.
might say. I'm right where I'm supposed to be. Um, and I would encourage students to be interested in finding the people who know uh, that they wake up to be helpful to them. There are people at every university who do this.
Yes.
Find them.
Yeah.
And I think that can, those three things cobbled together create some of the impact of Project Rise.
Yes, yeah. When you're describing this, I'm reminded of the equity and mental health framework that was developed by the Steve Fund, and our program worked closely with them in partnership in developing these specific actionable guidelines that institutions of higher education can lean into, can build upon and embrace in order to support the mental health needs of students of color much more effectively. And so, although the equity and mental health framework was actually created for campuses, what you're describing is something that we also believe, which is that the framework itself can also be used by families as a resource, right? In exactly the ways that you just described. So, families can ask themselves and encourage their students of color to ask, on my particular campus, is the mental health of students of color and identity being magnified, prioritized, and centralized? Where is this happening? In which places? Where can I find these spaces? And more specifically, to your point, where and how can I develop and nurture these transactional relationships?
Mhm.
Um, some of these spaces, I think, as you mentioned, might be like these opportunities might exist certainly in traditional spaces, right? Like the
Mhm.
counseling center, maybe in the
Mhm.
dean of students' office.
Mhm.
Certainly, we would hope that, but also through student organizations, through specific student programming like Project Rise, through the multicultural, or even through the Black Cultural Center. But help your child to understand that they need to seek these spaces and access them effectively. Um,
And
I
and
also, yeah.
I was just going to jump in. Hold it. I want to put a
Okay.
pin there
Okay.
because I tell families so often. Look at me pointing my finger now when they're having this
I
thought.
see you.
Um, I tell families we have figured out a lot of the magic over the 47 years or so that old AAA has been at UVA. We figured out a lot, but what we have not figured out is how to get the magic to students who we
Mm.
can't see.
Yeah.
That's hard. So to your point, I think that's a gold mine.
Yeah.
That if they are passive and waiting to just receive this flood of support, we're going to fail them. We've been failing students in that same way for years. So, but the moment they become visible, the magic happens.
Yeah.
So just make that first step. Make a commitment to find some location, some organization, some person, because then all of the transactions begin to flow through to the students. And I think you were right on the money there.
Yeah. So have hope that the magic exists and
Yes,
learn how to seek that magic out on your
yes,
campus.
yes.
So, emerging research is showing that racism and discrimination causes illnesses and death, even premature aging, and has impacts even at a cellular level.
Yes.
Um, I wonder if we could talk a little bit, therefore, so important to mention and speak about and be knowledgeable about practices of prevention. And I
Hmm.
wonder what advice you have for families about, you've mentioned some already, but any
Yes.
additional advice for families
Hmm.
about preventative actions that they can take in order to be an ally to their student in
Yes.
college, like that walking
Yes.
alongside that you described so beautifully earlier.
Yeah. Hmm. I think I'll only name a few. I could do this. We could do this for years. I love these conversations. I think some of the most important that I've learned from the work that I've been doing now, for a lot of years, um, that is so painful to me to watch, for instance, in students of color when they sort of grapple with the question of whether or not this concept of meritocracy is real or not, right? Because we do such a good job of indoctrinating our children with this thought that, if they work really hard, they'll get what they deserve. And I have seen it year after year. That's not entirely how it works.
No.
For a whole lot of the reasons
Mhm.
why these conversations exist, because racism and discrimination are so systematic and so successfully oppressive, that our students have these wake up calls when they discover, I have a 3.9 and yet I'm still underemployed, or I'm not employed, or I have 4.0 and I didn't get into grad school, right? All of these
Mhm.
things still happen. So, really, as a family, I would encourage you to start to have real conversations, not just the hopeful ones that we hope for the best for you, or that we know you're going to be the savior of our little town, right? I remember being sent to college from my little small town. I was definitely burdened with that Messiah thing. I was going to
Mhm.
save the town. Um, but that's not how it works.
Yeah.
So having students identify with their own desire to work hard for themselves, independent of what outcomes happen, but working hard for the sake of growing oneself is important. I think another thing that is connected to this cellular sort of conversation is the weight of silent trauma,
Mhm.
carrying things just internally. And so many of our students and adults at this point just sort of suffer silently. And one of the things that I've discovered is that if we can help people just say things aloud, say things into the universe. For instance, it was so easy for me to say, today is a wonderful day, right?
Yes.
Now, I don't know, Willa, I would have said 2 weeks ago, today is not that, right?
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
didn't have a space. I
Yeah.
just sort of dealt with that for 2 weeks. And here we are now, though. We can speak, but really giving opportunity to begin to say things aloud. So I don't feel confident in my chemistry skills, which makes me anxious about my future as a physician, right? Being able to say that without feeling like the universe will crush you. Just say things aloud.
Mhm.
The other thing is help your child become a student of history, so that they're not surprised when complicated things happen. So, for instance, right now, I'm talking about things that can easily be understood, right? Nobody should be surprised that just because you work hard, you don't get to be the CEO of Merck. It just doesn't happen that way. There are a whole lot of variables to go into that, and we can understand those things. So, really, sort of helping people not be surprised at how the world works, especially in ways that we understand quite well. I think that's really important. I think another thing that is probably really helpful um, to students of color, particularly Black and brown ones, when they come into the university, I think they are immediately forced to make a false choice. And that is
Mm,
often a false choice between whether they will be a Black or brown person or whether they will be a university person. And I think that's sort of a really interesting paradigm to sort of force them into, where all of a sudden they have to shelve something that's very salient to them in order to gain access that other students have without thinking about it. So for me, I think that question and that false dichotomy actually creates an urgency around educating our students about the wholeness of themselves, which includes their gender, their ethnicity, their age, disability status, race, ethnicity, sex. All of that stuff is important because it's what comes together to create the whole person, rather than being forced to deal with that false question just about ethnicity, because
yes.
you can be Black and be everywhere. You can be Hispanic and be everywhere. You can be Native American and be Asian, Hawaiian. You can be your ethnic self and still be every other thing. And I think that's really important for our students and really encouraging them to do that. And then the last thought I think is about, I referenced this earlier, just about being listening and being heard. Um, But there is also the other sense of being seen and
Mm,
seeing others that I think is also important. And we don't elevate that enough. We rely on, what John Harper started to describe, many years ago as um, serendipitous encounters.
mm.
Somebody just happens to stumble onto somebody. And I'm one of them. We discovered serendipity has saved so many Black men. Um, I remember, when I was an undergrad, Gilbert Rochon, who was a professor there at the time, saw me on our Avenue of the Oaks, and he said, "Hey, you're the computer kid, right?" And he says, "I need somebody who can be the student director of my urban studies and public policy lab." And I didn't know him. He had only read an article that I had gotten some fellowship with a new computer, and history is made, right?
Yes.
But we can't rely on those separate serendipitous encounters because too many of us will be missed. And I think having your young man develop an interest in being seen by someone and then seeing that person and ultimately seeing others is probably the greatest advice I can give any
Yes.
parent.
This is really an excellent set of recommendations, and I appreciate also that you've mentioned this previously in our fireside chat here this
Mm,
afternoon. I appreciate that you're also focusing on, we did talk about how important it is to understand risk, but also how important it is to use asset-based and strengths-based approaches and asset-based language. I think of Dr.
yes.
Melanie Turvalon, who co-founded the approach of cultural humility, and she recently has coined the terms, and I love this phrasing of rising identities and rising
Mm,
populations in lieu of terms like marginalized or targeted populations. I think it's just a powerful reminder of how important this language is, especially when we are inundated with messages regarding the at-risk status of our young men of color. This language that amplifies assets and strengths versus deficits, again, I think is really important. This has been a really wide-ranging and incredibly illuminating conversation. As we prepare to wrap up, Dr. Mason, I wonder if you have just any final recommendations or parting advice to share with families.
I think, again, this is so old and so simple. Uh,
Sometimes old and simple is best, let's just say.
yes, I would say read. Have your young man read. I read now probably more academically than I do, leisurely. But when I was 9 to 12, I probably read hundreds of books written by Black people. I think I read Man Child in the Promised Land by Cloud Brown. When I was 9, that was the first adult book I read. Um, but what was really helpful about that was I was sort of peopling my inner world with other uncles,
Mm.
brothers, dads, grandpas who had understood and thought about this concept of blackness and black masculinity. I had that in me,
Yeah.
and that carried me a long way. So when I began to sort of make sense of my own, thoughts about sexual orientation and whether I would commit to, my now woman, wife, or, whether I would sort of have more man relationships than woman all of these sort of things were informed by those conversations I had been having with, all of the people I was reading when I was a young man. And I think because of, where we are in in our cultural climate, reading is so disincentivized, unfortunately. Uh, so I would encourage you to get your young man to read and read broadly, because it'll allow for them, like, when I started to read Giovanni's Room by
Mm.
James Baldwin.
Hmm.
I'm as a young man sort of grappling with the tensions around sexuality and how people can be banished for it, right? I had been
Yes.
thinking about that from
Yes.
9 to 11. It wasn't new to me at 18 to 22. I definitely think reading broadly is important. And then the other thing that seems so, again, simple, but golden is read with your
Mm.
child. Yes, they can do this, but remember, the learning happens in relation to others. So, yes, fill them with other experiences, but also work with them to metabolize them. So,
Yes.
do what you can to engage with your child in what he or she is reading, even if you yourself, and here the last bit, and I'm going to shout out my mother-in-law, wonderful woman in Louisiana, who wasn't particularly well, I shouldn't say well educated, because she obviously, that's a not a great thing to say. She was educated in the way that she was, that didn't include college.
Hmm.
um, Yet I'll never forget, she was one of the first people in my family to read my 400-page dissertation.
Mm.
That's
Wow.
commitment.
Yes.
She read it with me. She didn't understand it, but she understood me having written it. And that was important. And those sort of things are what any family can do. You don't
Yes.
have to have the same college education as your child, or high school education as your child, to express interest in what's happening in their minds,
Yeah.
because that then will create platforms for better development, foundations for deeper development of relationships between you and your child, which become models between child and university.
I love that you said so, like, simple but golden. And your grandmother really sort of demonstrated for you the power that all parental figures have, the opportunities and specific ways that we can help our young men of color, in particular, to live outside of the very narrow box often prescribed for them by society.
Mm.
And it's so helpful to hear these specific examples as demonstrated by, it was your grandmother, right?
No,
Uh,
mother-in-law,
your
mother-in-law.
mother-in-law. Oh, my mother-in-law. Want to give mother-in-law credit where mother-in-law
Yes,
credit is due and
I,
earned.
I got lucky with that one, man. I'm
Yes.
telling you.
And same here. So props to mother-in-law. Again, we want to do all that we can in these very helpful, specific, practical ways of encouraging our young men to explore all aspects of their social cultural identities, as exemplified by your mother-in-law.
Mhm.
So thank you so much, Dr. Mason, for sharing your wisdom and expertise with all of us today. And to the families listening, we want to acknowledge that despite our best efforts and wishes, race still matters and has a huge impact on the mental health and well-being of our young men and on all of our students. We hope this webinar has provided some resources and approaches to help support and talk with your students about access, privilege, their identity, and its meaning, and the importance of their mental health. For more information and to find the resources for your family to support the mental health and emotional well-being of your student, please visit stevefund.org. We wish you and your family all the best and invite you to become part of the Steve Fund family as we work together to promote mental health and emotional wellness of our students of color. I'm Dr. Stephanie Pinder-Amaker. Thank you.